Well, I'd like to begin with a few acknowledgments, and certainly the first thanks goes to Marissa Howard, who continues to host these talks. And I see a few new faces every time we get together. Just out of curiosity, how many of you are from the local Principia club and are associated or have some connection there? A little handful there. Well, that's great. I'm glad you got together for that. If you're not a member of the DeKalb Historical Society, I'd encourage you to join at some point. I think it supports a range of things as she was describing. And of course, these days, a knowledge of history appears all the more important as a basis of our lives. Now, although I consider myself a specialist in 19th and 20th century architecture, I'm currently working on a new lecture on ancient Egypt. So you may want to look out for the announcements of that. The talk contrasts how temples and monuments were documented in paintings and lithographs by a 19th century Scottish artist traveler named David Roberts, who was the first one to really go to these monuments in 1838. And I found myself last December of 2023 literally following his footsteps and photographing the monuments from the exact same position he stood when he made the paintings. So these before and after things of what they looked like in the middle of the 19th century, which in some cases was literally covered 2/3 of the whole monument was sand. You couldn't even get in the temples. The sand was up to the column capitals in some cases. And 2 or 3 of these monuments have been cut up and moved entirely to save them from drowning by the Aswan Dam construction. So all that is just really intriguing and something that I thought when I started in the history of architecture I would not get that involved with ancient Egypt, but I've been doing that of late. So you don't have to be an Egyptologist to come to the talk about tracing the route from Cairo to Abu Simbel, but that's one to look out for. Now, like this forthcoming Egypt talk, tonight's topic is different from the others in this lecture series in that it has nothing to do with DeKalb County, except that it has everything to do with historical research, the importance of archives and methodology. And therefore, I'd also like to acknowledge 2 archivists at Principia College who through the years have served my study and documentation of Bernard Maybeck and his work at the college. Melody Hoff-Belden, the current archivist, took time recently, no matter how busy she was with other projects, to search out documents that validated aspects of the Principia Commission that had been put into question, sometimes challenging minor but significant details of the record as I had related that history during past decades. And Principia's former archivist of many years was Jane Pfeiffer, who was instrumental in assisting me 2 decades ago in developing my doctoral dissertation into a book published by Gibbs Smith, now out of print, but we have some copies in the back if you're interested. It's called Maybeck at Principia College, The Art and Craft of Building. Jane spent years organizing the Maybeck-Morgan papers. In this case, Morgan refers to Maybeck's Principia client, Frederick E. Morgan, which is no relationship to Julia Morgan. Over the years, Mrs. Pfeiffer was ever at the ready for my archival inquiries and my double checking and my confirmations whenever I arrived at the door of the archives or whenever we corresponded by email. Jane and I still communicate every February 7th, which is Bernard Maybeck's birthday, to raise a glass in toast to Principia's architect, with Jane having the advantage of being able to do so in the living room of Anderson Hall. I just have to do it at home, you know. Moreover, Jane was always alert to note over the years the inconsistencies in scholarship emerging from California writers and authors writing about Maybeck and or Julia Morgan. Authors who often ignored or disparaged or misattributed the design work on Maybeck's last, longest, and largest commission, Principia College. Jane would write me asking, "Did you see that?" Or, "Where did that error of fact come from?" And finally, she admonished me, writing in 2023, "You really need to set the record straight," making sure that I had read the latest Julia Morgan biography, which regrettably had more misinformation about Principia. Then Principia College's student newspaper and its alumni magazine both repeated the latest misinformation, and that was just too much to bear for an author who has been educated at Principia from kindergarten through college. The Principia Purpose, the alumni magazine, printed my correction letter to the editor, along with a concurring letter written many years earlier by history professor Charles B. Hosmer Jr., who was my mentor at the college when I was there, who also sought to correct errors about Maybeck at the college during his day. Tonight, this lecture, a version of which I presented last October at the Southeast chapter of the Society of Architectural Historians meeting in Little Rock, in which I hope to publish, is my effort to set the record straight. So thank you, Jane Pfeiffer, for the nudge. I also recognize that some of the audience may not be familiar with Bernard Maybeck or Julia Morgan. Rest assured, the title of this talk, Juxtaposing the Two Architects, is not intended to belittle either designer. I think both of these architects are among the most accomplished designers in American history. As the subtitle of my book on Maybeck, and this is true of both architects, the professional designer must excel in the art and craft of building. Maybeck was ever the hands-on artisan craftsman, and Miss Morgan, despite her pressed suits and Parisian silk blouses and 5'0" stature, was often found 30 or more feet atop scaffolding at San Simeon, supervising decorative work on a tower or checking that some design detail was properly executed. They were both hands-on architects. The view that both architects are among the best that this country has produced is supported by two interesting facts. In 1991, members of the American Institute of Architects were surveyed in a national poll in which architects across the country were asked to name the 10 most significant architects in American history. As votes were compiled, predictable names arose, such as Frank Lloyd Wright and Louis Sullivan and H.H. Richardson and Thomas Jefferson. And when the top 10 list was calculated and published, Maybeck was on the list. Almost half a century earlier, the AIA awarded Maybeck its prestigious gold medal in 1951, 2 years after Frank Lloyd Wright received the same honor. Established in 1907, the gold medal is given annually, although not every year historically, to one architect worldwide. Despite Julia Morgan's extraordinary talents and significance as a pioneer among women in architecture, the profession and society remained slow to recognize her in like ways. Finally, in 2000, she was awarded the AIA Gold Medal posthumously, and indeed, it took until 2019 for the New York Times to publish her obituary, a full 62 years after her death. With its tail between its journalistic legs, the newspaper admitted, quote, since 1851, obituaries in the New York Times have been dominated by white men. With our periodic column called Overlooked, we're adding the stories of remarkable people whose deaths went unreported in the Times. So she got her obituary rather late. Interesting, one of the most astute architectural critics of the history of the New York Times was a woman, Ada Louise Huxtable. Well, like Maybeck, Julia Morgan was a prominent California architect of the early 20th century, initially, in fact, a protege of Bernard Maybeck. There was no architecture school at the University of California, Berkeley, when Miss Morgan attended college there from 1890 to 94. So she pursued a BS in engineering and became one of the best engineers in San Francisco. While at Berkeley, she joined other Maybeck students, all of them male students interested in architecture, but with no curriculum at the university. Maybeck actually taught descriptive geometry and other things at the university at the time, meeting informally in gatherings at Maybeck's house in Berkeley where they discussed architecture. Maybeck encouraged the best of them to go to Paris to attend the École des Beaux-Arts, which Maybeck thought to be the best architecture school available, although it was not exactly easily available. The École had been established under Colbert and Louis XIV, and since the 17th century, it had served to train French architects for prominent government jobs throughout France. There was resistance to admitting foreign students, although a few Americans had attended in the mid-19th century, including Richard Morris Hunt, who later designed Biltmore in North Carolina, and the Breakers in Newport, Rhode Island, and the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, and H.H. Richardson, whose masterpiece was the 1870s Trinity Church on Copley Square in Boston, not very far from the Christian Science Mother Church. And Maybeck himself was at the École from 1882 to 86, passing the entrance exam on his first try at the age of 20, which was almost unheard of. But certainly no women, French or American. The École was strictly a male academy. An American woman trained in architecture named Faye Kellogg applied in 1895, but was denied admission. Admittedly, presumably she was denied the privilege of even taking the entrance exams, which was a hurdle in its own self, but specifically on grounds of her gender. Women were later admitted to the painting section of the École when women were first granted the right to apply in June of 1897, although some historians minimize the significance of even that, noting that women were only allowed to take lecture courses and to use the library, but were not allowed to enroll in an official French atelier until 1900. For one, it was thought that late Victorian era students would not do well in a co-ed life drawing class. Well, historian Meredith Clausen offers an interesting illustration of the debate over gender, the class ceiling that Julia Morgan cracked. Quote, with men such as Charles Garnier guarding the keys, Clausen wrote, doors to the École remain firmly closed to women. In the 1890s, the famed architect of the Paris Opera was one of the most powerful architects in the system. He was also one of two architects on the committee established to study the contentious issue of admitting women to the École at all and to advise the Conseil Supérieur accordingly. In 1890, in the midst of the debate, Garnier vehemently argued against it, maintaining the presence of women in the atelier would be a distraction. Quote, it's impossible to put men and women together in the same room, he yelled, unable to contain himself in the usually decorous meetings. It's tantamount to placing gunpowder near fire. An explosive situation would demolish art altogether. While revealing as much anxiety about virility as professional concerns, Clausen, the historian, editorialized, quote, Garnier's outburst provoked an equally heated response from a usually calm sculptor, Eugene Guillaume, also on the committee, who supported the measure. You puerile ignoramus, Guillaume shouted back at Garnier. Trump's not the only one that calls people's names. You don't know what you're talking about. When an artist works, does he think of anything other than the project at hand? In a truly progressive school, there aren't men or women, but simply artists, inspired by a noble and pure ideal. Well, Garnier would have none of it. Oh, great sculptor, that may be possible for you as you're made of marble or wood like your statues. But for me, at 20 years of age, had there been a pretty young face next to my drafting board, to hell with my drawing. Ah, Guillaume, you are not a man. Well, Guillaume retorted, ah, Garnier, you are not an artist. So that seemed to have been the battle for a while. Well, Julia Morgan's first biographer, Sarah Boutelle, recounts the difficulties in that context that Julia Morgan faced in moving as a young woman by herself to Paris in 1896, the year after Faye Kellogg had failed to gain entry, and while the debate about admitting women was still underway. Alone in her room, she studied for months on end for the École entrance exams, which she initially failed, and then failed again the second time due to prejudice from the examiners. The second examination, it was clear that even though she excelled, they were not going to admit a woman. Maybeck encouraged her to join an independent atelier whose patron he thought would be open to accepting women for the training part that would allow her to possibly improve and pass it the third time. Finally, Miss Morgan, quote, just slipped in, as Clausen says, choosing her words based on patchy archival evidence in the Archive Nationale and reading of Miss Morgan's letters back home, riding on the coattails, or rather the petticoats, of women in painting and sculpture who had launched the admissions battle. This is how Clausen describes Julia Morgan's revolutionary École admission. Quote, while École professors were preoccupied with the knotty problem of whether to allow a male nude model whose presence might arouse unseemly urges in the women's drawing studio, Morgan quietly took the exams in architecture, passing the third time with a ranking of 13 out of 392 applicants. The top 30 would be admitted. And Miss Morgan was finally admise in November 1898, her presence barely acknowledged. This was revolutionary, but hardly anybody particularly noticed. Then she shows up for classes. Passing the entrance exam in late 1898 merely got Julia Morgan admitted. She was at that time 26 going on 27. The rules in France meant that you had to finish your entire degree by the age of 30. She then had to participate in enough periodic assigned design problems and win top prizes or mentions to accumulate sufficient number of points to move from the second class to the premier class of the École, and then earn another 10 points at the first level, all before her 30th birthday on January 30th, 1902. When she submitted her final project on time, just before her birthday, and had to wait until February to know the results, one can only imagine her emotions. But she again was judged in the top competitors at the school-wide and received her needed points and was granted her École certificate. She was the first woman in history to graduate in architecture from the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, French or American. So, Julia Morgan is no slouch. She returned to San Francisco to become the first woman in architecture to be registered as an architect, and initially took a job as a draftsman for John Galen Howard, who was head of the new architecture program at Berkeley, and who boasted he had to pay her very little because she was a woman. She was, in fact, one of the best trained architects, male or female, in the entire country. She soon established her own independent practice, built houses all over the Bay Area, designed women's clubs and YWCAs from Berkeley to Honolulu to Tokyo, and spent decades as the personal architect for William Randolph Hearst, designing and supervising construction of San Simeon, known as Hearst's Castle, in California, as well as his other houses and projects. And she remained a close friend and colleague of Bernard Maybeck throughout their long careers in the Bay region. So what is the debate regarding Bernard Maybeck, Julia Morgan, and the Principia Commission? I'll begin by citing a major architectural critic's assessment written 40 years ago regarding the life work of Bernard Maybeck. It's an essay published 27 years after Maybeck's death. Some of you may know the writings of Rainer Banham, an industrial and modern architecture specialist. I've often wondered if I might have influenced Banham's thinking about Maybeck in as much as 4 years prior to the publication of his 1984 essay. Banham attended a paper that I presented in Madison, Wisconsin at the annual conference of the Society of Architectural Historians, a paper on the subject of Maybeck's Principia project. After which the senior scholar invited me to join his gathering of colleagues and students in an informal post-session conversation about architecture. Banham was one of the giants of my then relatively newly adopted profession. Although Banham's scholarship in general was not in any way focused on Maybeck, less than 4 years after that encounter in Madison, excuse me, I should have shut that off ages ago. I think City Springs wants to renew my tickets.
Do you have enough light? The lights are getting dim.
Well, you'll see the pictures a little bit better the more it is, so I think that's really why. Yeah, I've shut that off. Sorry about that. I'm going to back up a little bit here. Banham's scholarship in general is not focused on Maybeck, but less than 4 years after that encounter in Madison, he wrote an article whose title certainly caught my eye. In 1984, Rayner Banham published on the pages of the Journal of the Society of Architectural Historians an essay entitled "The Plot Against Bernard Maybeck," unquote. The provocative title referenced the duality in Maybeck's body of work, a life's work which, in simple terms, fell into two camps. His domestic scale work in Berkeley, that is the Bay Region tradition, and his monumental and classical design as an academically trained Beaux-Arts architect, something of the akin to the Palace of Fine Arts, which you see on the screen in San Francisco. Maybeck's established reputation, Banham wrote 4 decades ago, quote, covers only his work as a domestic-scaled craftsman-style designer, and its acknowledged masterpiece is the First Church of Christ Zionist in Berkeley of 1910. The virtually non-existent half covers his monumental and classical buildings, and Banham says the manner in which the literature still handles the latter effectively underplays their qualities and thus does disservice to his craft and originality as a designer. Maybeck's cardinal sin at commissions such as the classical Palace of Fine Arts or the Tudoresque Principia College was to design in an evocative, traditional, historicist language based on an artistic but not a modernist, functionalist, generalized vision. And this eclectic, indeed this scenographic side of Maybeck, outside the modernist idiom, had been ignored by the perpetrators of the plot. The dismissive writers about Maybeck, moreover, were California authors who largely praised Maybeck's California work and were scornful of his work outside the state. Few appear to have traveled beyond the San Francisco region to evaluate the non-Bay region buildings on site. As Banham wrote in 1984, the political historian can no longer interview Millard Fillmore or Woodrow Wilson, but the architectural historian can still go and see a building, unquote. In the introduction to my 2004 book on Maybeck's Principia Commission, I sought to address these oversights and unenthusiastic appraisals. And 3 years later, Mark Anthony Wilson's balanced and insightful treatment of Maybeck's complete life work, that is his whole career, not just this last commission, further contributed to dispelling dismissive attitudes, correcting misinformation, and bringing greater balance to assessments of Maybeck's whole body of work. As Maybeck's Principia client, Frederick Morgan, observed in 1931 with regard to the subsequently largely ignored College Commission, quote, and this is Frederick Morgan, it is perfectly clear that Mr. Maybeck regards Principia as his last great work. It will be, when completed, the most enduring thing he has ever done, and will, as he sees it, enable him to thus indelibly engrave his architectural mark upon posterity. It is natural that an artist should wish his final work to represent the best in the sum total of his own personal experience, unquote. Freddie wrote great letters, by the way. Moreover, Principia's college chapel to Maybeck was one of the most significant buildings of his 50 years in practice, a project in which he lavished much personal attention and detailing, and a building uniquely responsive to client requests, and thus an embodiment of the spirit of the client as Maybeck understood it. This affinity of spirit was fundamental to Maybeck and lent increased significance, as Maybeck scholar Mark Wilson called it. This chapel, he said, was one of the most elegantly beautiful college chapels ever designed in the United States, unquote. Early writers, however, viewing the chapel, or indeed Maybeck's dozen other executed Principia buildings only from drawings and photographic images archived in California, seem unable to look beyond the college architect's non-progressive style. It's not very modern looking, although it's structural steel and poured concrete and Indiana limestone on the outside and all kinds of things going on here. But as Banham observed to be a systemic problem, they were underplaying the qualities that the architecture had and doing disservice to the architect's craft and originality as a designer. And so Banham might well have added another dimension to the plot. The implication that Maybeck's work outside California may be largely ignored as insignificant, that his late work, no longer nurtured by the California setting and the environmental beneficence of what Leslie Freudenheim has characterized as California's Bay Region tradition, redwood houses and the like, suggests an aging architect in decline and less involved in the craft of building, reinforcing the view that the modernist's eye, Maybeck's eclectic late work also suffers from its stylistic borrowings and its historicist forms. Esther McCoy, for instance, whose 1960 book, Five California Architects, introduced Maybeck to many readers, gave Principia a scant 4 sentences, with factual errors in 3 of them. McCoy wrote, "The construction did not start until 1938, when in fact Maybeck's executed Principia buildings were erected from 31 to 39 and were largely finished by then. According to McCoy, 8 buildings were built. There were 13 Maybeck buildings erected on campus and 1 in the village of Elsa. And she claimed that Maybeck did not supervise the work, whereas he took multiple site visits throughout the period, staying in Elsa for weeks or months at a time. And finally, McCoy dismissed the campus work by asserting it lacked Maybeck's customary vigor, although there is no evidence known to this writer that McCoy ever visited the Illinois campus to evaluate the Maybeck buildings firsthand. The first major monograph on Maybeck, Kenneth Cardwell's Bernard Maybeck, Artisan, Architect, Artist, was comparably dismissive. I thought with that subtitle he was going to be right on, but he wasn't. Cardwell wrote, quote, "The final development of the Principia has little interest for the architect looking for inventive and imaginative design," unquote. Again, there's no evidence that Cardwell ever traveled to the Midwest to see the completed buildings on site, but based his assessment on photographs and drawings and a prejudicial view that Principia's traditional stylistic language was of no interest to contemporary readers or modernist steel and glass practitioners. Had he gone there, he would have seen extraordinary concrete work, for one thing. The irony is that Maybeck's work by itself, I mean, I wrote an article one time that said Maybeck was a brutalist before brutalism, so it was a wonderful kind of use of concrete. Well, in Cardwell's 256-page monograph treating Principia, he only gave it 6 paragraphs, publishing the architect's unexecuted general campus plan and a preliminary site plan for the Loch Lynn campus that was never built, misdating both those drawings, by the way, and including conceptual and preliminary drawings of buildings that were not executed in the form that he illustrated, all projected for the abandoned Loch Lynn campus site in Missouri. Cardwell illustrated from the rear only one constructed Maybeck building at Principia College in Elsa, Illinois. That is where it actually was built, reproducing a 1932 construction photograph of a nearly completed dormitory. It was called Building Number 5, which we know as Howard House. Most egregious was Cardwell's statement, repeated by later writers, that, quote, the campus was built at Elsa, Illinois, with Julia Morgan as supervising architect and Maybeck as design consultant.
Yeah.
The plot thickens.
Yeah.
Where did that come from? And as if that were not enough, biographers of Maybeck and Julia Morgan began to credit Julia Morgan with some or most of the Principia designs. 15 years after Cardwell's pioneering monograph, California historian Sally Woodbridge published her book, Bernard Maybeck, Visionary Architect, and appended a chronology of, quote, the buildings and projects by Bernard Maybeck, unquote, which she writes was based on a list compiled by Kenneth Cardwell for his monograph, which we just looked at a moment ago. And in fact, both of those project lists, because I've got a copy of it, came out of Maybeck's office. They were based on a catalog raisonné of Maybeck's projects compiled in 1947 by Maybeck's partner, Mark White, who happened to be his brother-in-law, too, after Maybeck and White closed its offices. Woodbridge's chronology includes for the years 1930 to 38, quote, general plan and buildings for Principia College, Elsa, Illinois, but cites Julia Morgan as associate architect, which Mark White, who made that list in 1947, didn't say at all. In her narrative, Woodbridge continued in the McCoy-Cardwell vein, advancing the notion that during the 1920s, Maybeck had stepped back from his noteworthy and innovative early work in California. Woodbridge has characterized these late years as a declining period of disengagement in which, quote, the delightful improvisations that appeared in his earlier buildings are absent from the later ones, unquote. Woodbridge's explanation for her reduced appraisal of Maybeck's Principia project is set forth early in her study and repeated twice. She writes, quote, after reorganizing his office in 1921 to limit his responsibilities to the design phase of projects, Maybeck associated with other architects who took charge of the construction process. Thus, he no longer interviewed personally in the crafting of the buildings he designed as he had earlier in his career, unquote. I don't want to use foul language, but that is. My 1973 dissertation at Cornell, Maybeck and Principia, a study of an architect-client relationship, substantially available to Woodbridge when she prepared her 1992 Maybeck monograph, suggests how misleading is any assertion of Maybeckian disinterest and limited engagement at Principia. Contention, however, that has been repeated by others, and most recently in 2022 by Julia Morgan biographer Victoria Kastner. However, numerous participants active in the planning and execution of the college projects have testified to Maybeck's role at every stage, from general campus plans and conceptual and preliminary designs for the college to projects for multiple buildings at the ultimately discarded Loch Lynn campus site, to revising plans and supervising construction of most of his design buildings in Elsa, others built after Maybeck's retirement with construction supervised by Maybeck's clerk of the works, Edward Hussey, or by Maybeck's selected successor, Henry Gutterson. And finally, the record includes additional Maybeck designs for future Principia buildings ultimately unexecuted. It is all there in the archives. Archived documents, moreover, record, as my previous quote from Maybeck's client suggests, that Maybeck's own view that Principia represented the culmination of his life work. At a luncheon given on March 21st, 1932, probably a fundraiser in California for the Principia project because it was just getting underway, at the Commercial Club in San Francisco, Maybeck spoke of, quote, the life dreams of different architects realized in their buildings, unquote, that it had been, quote, the dream of a lifetime to build something of great beauty and usefulness for mankind, unquote, and that his, quote, being asked to plan for the building of this monumental Principia College was a rare opportunity to realize his greatest life dream, unquote. Well, a Principia member of the Board of Trustees was in that audience and called it an impressively solemn moment. And it does not suggest the architect's disengagement in any way from the extensive project and the opportunities that Principia represented. Writers, however, have repeatedly sought to assign substantive credit to Julia Morgan as an associate architect, as though the Principia Commission were what architects today would call a joint venture. Woodbridge writes that in 1938, Maybeck, quote, withdrew from this project altogether, leaving Julia Morgan and Henry Gutterson to carry on the work, unquote. The truth is, the project was nearly completed by 1938, and Maybeck was aged 76, well past retirement age. Moreover, Mark White's authoritative list of Maybeck and White's projects, compiled as noted soon after Maybeck finally closed his office in 1942, included no such formal affiliation with Miss Morgan as associate architect on this or any Maybeck project, except one, this one, the Women's Gymnasium and Swimming Pool at the University of California, Berkeley, which dates from 1924 and was a joint venture of Bernard Maybeck and Julia Morgan working together. Moreover, in 1938, when Maybeck did finally retire from the Principia project, he designated Henry Gutterson only as his successor as Principia's architect for future work. Any notion of Julia Morgan's taking over Maybeck's Principia project clearly reflects an uncritical repetition by Julia Morgan's biographers of misinformation. Miss Morgan's assistance during the Depression years in providing Maybeck additional draftsmen to accelerate the preparation of working drawings for the Principia project has been the catalyst for some of the misattribution of design credit and is unnecessary for a woman who designed close to 750 buildings on her own and who need not be credited with designs that were not hers. Moreover, suggestions have been advanced even by Miss Morgan's first major biographer, Sarah Boutell, that Julia Morgan served as the supervising architect at Principia, while other writers, as noted above, claim she should be considered as an associate architect in a joint venture akin to Maybeck and Morgan's Gymnasium. Borrowing Bannum's words, this literature may constitute a second plot against Bernard Maybeck, led by the suggestion that Miss Morgan should be credited with the design of at least an unnamed women's dormitory at Principia and perhaps more. It is true that Miss Morgan loaned out draftsmen and office space to assist in the production of working drawings at a time when Maybeck's office production was stretched, when Maybeck's Principia client was in a hurry to begin construction, and while Julia Morgan's own office was reduced due to the Great Depression. This concerted production of working drawings with Miss Morgan's assistance began 7 years into the Maybeck-Principia Commission. Maybeck and Principia had been planning the college since the early 1920s, with Principia taking the decision not to begin construction until funds were actually in hand. In other words, they intended to take out no mortgages. Principia spent the decade of the 1920s raising money, and Maybeck working on preliminary plans whose buildings, like any architectural project, would eventually needed to be converted by office draftsmen into working drawings by which the contractor would construct the designs. As years slipped by, the question of Maybeck's age and possible retirement raised its head. Maybeck had turned 65 in 1927, and the following year, following a surgical operation, he developed a life-threatening infection that raised questions as to whether he would actually survive. his wife Annie wanted him to retire. But then in late 1929, Principia received a pledge of $1 million from Clarence Howard, opening the door to begin construction. Now Maybeck's final great architectural work was on the fast track. We all know what occurred in late 1929. With the stock market crash and the spiraling economy reaching its nadir in 1932, much of Principia's investments were in stock. So there was an urgency to convert the investments to capital improvements. The Institute was in a race to build because the stocks were going down, the buildings needed to go up. And in fact, it was thought that the college was the largest privately funded construction project during the Depression era. The other one, by the way, was the publishing house in Boston. Maybeck also always operated from a relatively small office, but now faced an all-hands-on-deck urgency for draftsmen to produce working drawings. Julia Morgan loaned him some of hers and provided additional workspace as well. Structural engineering drawings were executed in a third office by the structural engineer Henry Duell of San Francisco. The experience of most architects during the early 1930s was that jobs were reduced to almost zero, so Principia was able to provide employment for draftsmen in 3 offices. They needed to rush. It is also clear that Miss Morgan's design role in the Principia Commission, however, was far less than Morgan biographers have suggested, and from the perspective of the client and other participants in the projects, including the draftsmen involved, it was virtually nil. Such shared office production was a matter of loaning out an adequate workforce and office space to prepare Maybeck's working drawings, not to design Principia's buildings. And yet, the assertion persists, and biographers of Julia Morgan expand the misdirected focus comparable to Bannon's observation regarding the 2 dimensions of Maybeck's life work. 4 historians of Julia Morgan's career can be investigated regarding Miss Morgan's association with the Principia Commission. Sarah Holmes Boutell, whose biography was published in 1988, Ginger Watson from 1990, Mark Wilson from 2007, and Victoria Kastner just a couple years ago from 2022. Sarah Boutell was the author of the first major monograph on Julia Morgan, a role that parallels Cardwell's seminal study of Maybeck. As Cardwell does for Maybeck, Boutell included an extended chronological listings of buildings by Julia Morgan, including, quote, 1930s Principia College Women's Dormitories, Elsa, Illinois, unquote. In her extensive text surveying Miss Morgan's work, Boutell writes, and I share this as an extended quote because those of you who are connected with Principia will pick up on this immediately. Another campus building by Morgan in the English tradition is the women's dormitories at Principia, a Christian Science college for women in Elsa, Illinois. This commission came as part of a new campus design that Maybeck was asked to do in 1930. He brought the whole project to Morgan's office because his own facilities were not large enough for this scale of drafting. Maybeck and Morgan worked out free versions of the Jacobean revival style. Morgan visited the site just once, but Edward Hussey from her office and the Maybecks lived at Elsa during the design and even during some of the construction. The campus reflects the stamp of the 2 California architects who worked on it, unquote. Every phrase of every sentence of that summary contains errors of fact. The singular paragraph in 1988 in Boutell's only statement about Principia, but it establishes the precedent for writers to credit Miss Morgan with Principia designs. Boutell provides no illustration of the women's dormitory in question. We don't know which one she's talking about in drawings or photographs, nor does she indicate what she's referring to. Her misstatements are plentiful. Principia is not, never was, a women's college. It is a coeducational liberal arts college. No campus buildings, quote, by Morgan, are by her, and Boutel leaves unexplained what Miss Morgan's stamp reflected on the Principia campus might be. The commission dates from Maybeck's initial contacts with Principia as early at least as 1923, not 1930, and with conversations with client Frederick Morgan, who is no relation, as early as 1921. Edward Hussey, who she cites as Miss Morgan's draftsman, was hired by Maybeck, not by Miss Morgan. He used to work for Miss Morgan earlier in the 20s, but he was hired by Maybeck as a draftsman and subsequently hired by his clerk of the works. A clerk of the work effectively means that you are representing the architect on site during the construction. Finally, Miss Morgan's singular visit to Elsa in 1932 was at the request of Principia's architect Maybeck, who wanted her to see the then partially built project, and it was a trip that was merely a stopover of a couple days, incidental to a personal trip east to visit her family. Boutel does offer one general and indisputable statement regarding Miss Morgan's relationship and cooperation with Maybeck as they pursued their independent architectural practices. She writes this, and this is true. The architect most closely associated with Morgan was Bernard Maybeck, and their collaboration was a matter of friendship and long mutual respect. Room was always made available in her office for Maybeck, who never maintained a spacious office. For an occasional large project, he would hire some of her staff or come in and work there himself, doing his expansive and colorful drawings. That's a truer picture of what really took place as these blueprints were being produced. 2 years after Boutel's monograph appeared, biographer Ginger Wadsworth published her book, Julia Morgan, Architect of Dreams. It's a much shorter volume. She also has a group of listing of Miss Morgan's projects and doesn't mention Principia either in the text or in the list of Miss Morgan's work. When Mark Wilson published his monograph on Julia Morgan in 2007, he summarized the Principia Commission in 3 paragraphs, offering, among Julia Morgan's biographers, a more carefully worded assessment and description of Miss Morgan's actual work. And he writes, and he gets this really out of my book, Maybeck turned to Miss Morgan for help with this project since his office was not large enough to handle all the drafting and various buildings that were involved. His conclusions regarding the involvement of Miss Morgan are based on the documentation that had appeared in my book that had been published 3 years earlier. Wilson virtually quotes my conclusion by saying draftsmen and other assistants, when Maybeck was busy, were occasionally and informally contributed, and Miss Morgan occasionally and informally contributed criticisms and suggestions, but certainly was not designing the buildings. And I'm confident that Wilson, who also published a book on Bernard Maybeck, so he's written a monograph on Morgan, and he's also written a monograph on Maybeck, and I know he's got a good balanced sense of Maybeck because he puts on the front cover the masterpiece, the First Church of Christ Zionists, and he puts on the back cover a women's dormitory at Principia College by Maybeck. As recently as 2022, Victoria Kastner stirred up the plot again, raising the question of Julia Morgan's involvement in the Principia Commission. Kastner had served for 4 decades as the official historian of Julia Morgan's Hearst Castle at San Simeon, authored a trilogy of books on San Simeon as a California landmark, and is now an independent scholar. In her recent intimate biography of Julia Morgan, and this is actually what prompted Jane Pfeiffer to say, you've got to set the record straight. She echoes Boutel, and she writes, a year and a half ago, in 1931, despite her heavy workload, Julia Morgan agreed to take over Maybeck's commission for the women's dormitories at Principia. Again, which women's dormitories are not indicated, and although she sounds like she means all of them, she doesn't indicate which ones. Kastner goes on to say that architect Edward Hussey, who had worked for Miss Morgan in the late 1920s, was representing Julia Morgan at the Elsa site. Whereas Hussey, by his own testimony, I lived with him for a week in Berkeley and taped interviews with him when he was, this is in the 70s, he states that he was clerk of the works working for Maybeck. He kept a diary. He records in that diary the day he was hired by Maybeck, the day he moved to Elsa, the day he left Elsa and went back to California. Given even all of that misinformation, what suddenly became rather awkward for me professionally was Kastner's claim that the first general campus layout at Elsa was drawn by Julia Morgan. What was awkward was that this aeroplane perspective, which is dated April 13th, 1931, and indeed on the drawing itself, the architect's block says Maybeck in white, but Kastner says that that drawing was irreparably drawn by Julia, not to be refuted. This was embarrassing to me because my publisher decided to use this very drawing as the end papers for my major book on Bernard Maybeck at California. So this drawing is printed inside the front cover, inside the back cover, splashed over 2 pages on an oversized book, and now she's telling me that it wasn't drawn by Maybeck, that had nothing to do with it. And hence, Jane Pfeiffer says, you gotta handle this, deal with this. What seemed worse, of course, was, I said, was I wrong 50 years ago when I wrote my dissertation and looked at this? Then I started thinking, well, this woman who said that has spent 4 decades as the historian of Julia Morgan's San Simeon. She must know something. I don't know. What does she know? Maybe she knows something about Julia Morgan's drafting style, and I wouldn't know necessarily, so I thought, this is really embarrassing. So one of my great aha moments as a researcher came when I corresponded with Principia's archivist, who discovered in the Principia archives the April 22nd, 1931, quote, report on work on the Principia for the week ending April 18th. This drawing is dated April 13th. These weekly reports itemize the work of each draftsman working in all 3 offices, listing personnel and what they were working on. And the reason for that is it justified the charges being made to Principia. This weekly report covered all the work in all 3 locations: the office premises of Maybeck, the office premises of Julia Morgan, and the office premises of the structural engineer, Henry Duell. It listed hours worked and what they were working on. Financial reports submitted in order to justify the charges. The 5 individuals working at the Maybeck and White office included Maybeck's brother-in-law, architect John White, whose entry in that report reads, quote, finished the aeroplane perspective of April 13th. That was the title and the date of the drawing in question. What this document confirms, therefore, is that this important perspective drawing of Maybeck's proposed layout of Principia College buildings was irrefutably not drawn by Julia, but by John White of Maybeck and White. Also of interest with respect to any Principia drawings is Maybeck's July 24th, 1931 instruction, that is early in the working drawings phase of the work, recorded in the weekly report for July 20th of 31. Quote, Mr. Maybeck wants to have all drawings from this office and Julia Morgan's office and Henry Duell's office initialed by him before they're sent out. The draftsmen, even occupying Julia Morgan's office, were working for Maybeck. And there's the document, the famous archival treasure. Thank you to the archivist. Ultimately, the dismissive attitude of earlier writers regarding Maybeck's monumental and classical buildings, which is Bannon's plot, and the over-promotion by California architects of Julia Morgan's role as an alleged designer of Principia, which I'm calling the second plot, like quotations attributed to Mark Twain, are reports of my death are greatly exaggerated, are classic cases of what current terminology might call fake news. What are the lessons for us as architectural historians and authors? Read critically and write critically. Don't believe and repeat everything you read. Argue, but show proof. Go look at the buildings on site and rely on primary above secondary sources, that is, archival resources that preserve the correspondence, the documents, the records, actual participants, architect and client, or possible interview those who are involved. Oral history can be a great primary source. And I suppose I had another advantage in knowing Maybeck's client, Frederick Morgan, personally. Maybeck was 55 when he first met the 26-year-old Frederick Morgan in 1917. When Maybeck retired from active practice in 1938 after the Principia work, his Principia work was finished, he was 76, and Frederick, who was appointed Principia College president that year, was 47. I was 3. But I grew up in St. Louis and lived across the street from the Morgans. Indeed, I grew up and was educated at Principia. When I was in elementary school during the 1950s, Frederick Morgan was still president of Principia. And then from 1957, he served as chairman of the Board of Trustees. We all called him Mr. Freddie. I was in high school at Principia when Mr. Freddie stepped down from chairing the Board of Trustees. He retired and moved to Florida in 1959, although he remained on the Treasurer's Board, Trustees Board until 1965, my junior year in college. I completed my dissertation on Maybeck and Principia in 1973, presented a copy to Mr. Freddie, and his letter to me is a cherished momentum of my knowing him and knowing of his contribution to Principia College as Maybeck's go-between. That same year that my dissertation was completed, in 1973, Frederick Morgan returned to Principia to be awarded an honorary doctorate of humane letters from the college. On this and other occasions, history professor Charles Hosmer and I interviewed Mr. Freddie about his role in the 1920s and 30s as director of Principia College, essentially Maybeck's personal client. Maybeck said, I'm going to talk to one person as a client. I'll eventually, at the very beginning, talk to faculty, students, and everything, but at one point, the door was shut. Anything else went through Mr. Frederick Morgan. And while writing my dissertation, I traveled to Sarasota to interview him, and subsequently sent blank tapes and questions for him to dictate answers and fill in missing gaps in the record. When Principia celebrated its centennial in 1998, I was asked to give the centennial address. The topic was Maybeck and Principia. My book did not appear until 2004, 47 years after Maybeck's death and 21 years after Frederick's passing. My transcribed interviews, now preserved in the Principia archives, include conversations with 2 of Maybeck's draftsmen on the Principia job, including Edward Hussey, with 2 different school treasurers, with former faculty and students from the Maybeck years, and most importantly, with Maybeck's direct contact throughout the college planning and construction, Frederick E. Morgan. There are multiple interviews with him. These interviews and archival sources ensured that the book was going to be more accurate than it might otherwise have been. It ultimately won 2 book awards from scholarly societies, and I heard secondhand that the assessment of professional book dealer, the owner of the Prairie Avenue bookstore in Chicago, a store that the Financial Terms called the best architectural bookshop in the world, the book dealer described Bernard Maybeck at Principia College as the most thorough treatment of an architectural commission ever written. It's in the book. Any of those biographers could have looked at it, you know. Indeed, I was first attracted to the Principia project because it was rich with preserved primary documentation and a great archive. Maybeck was a California-based architect working for some 18 years with a client based in the Midwest. They wrote letters to each other, back and forth for 2 decades. And I'd get through all these letters, suddenly there'd be a break. And I said, wait a minute, there's a whole month, where are the letters? Maybeck had gone to the site and was there. He was not writing letters anymore, you know, so then he'd go back to California, the letters would start up again. The Maybeck collection at Principia's archives contains 1,118 written communications between Maybeck and his client, preserves blueprints, red line drawings, pastel sketches of Maybeck's Principia work, and contains albums and boxes of 1,655 photographs of construction in progress, the chapel, the dormitories, taken by Maybeck's architects on the college site between the winter of 1930 and December of 1934. And some of these photographs show Maybeck on site, supervising the construction. Ultimately, these primary documents, covering nearly 2 decades of an architect-client relationship, and the architecture itself, speaks to us and confirms Bernard Maybeck's role as Principia's sole